press the button. Okay, so just letting you know it's recorded now, right? So, okay, so with this tutorial, we are covering 2 chapters. So similar to what we did from the previous tutorial, I'm just going to go through a few main points for chapter 2 before we talk about the tutorial questions, yeah? So what did we learn in chapter 2? In chapter 2, the main focus was to introduce the different monetary systems in the past. So these are the systems in place for countries to exchange their currencies, right? For them to work out how much their currency is worth relative to another currency, okay? So we started with the bimetallism system where we traded, where we exchanged using 2 metals. So we had gold and we had silver, right? Now, when people discover more gold mines, when gold became more abundant in the system, people started to ditch the silver and they only exchanged using gold, right? So as a result, we then move on to the classical gold standard where people only use gold as the main medium of exchange between countries. So under the classical gold standards, your currencies are fixed against the gold, and then your exchange rate would be determined by the relative gold content of the 2 countries, right? The classical gold standard came into a collapse when World War I happened and people started to devalue their currency against the gold. And this was motivated by their need to finance their war, right? So they need to export more to be able to have enough money to finance their weapons, so on and so forth. So after the classical gold standard collapsed, people came up with this exchange regime called the gold exchange standard, where instead of packing your currency against the gold, now they only pack the USD against the gold, right? So the only currency that is pegged against the gold is the USD, and I think it was pegged at a price of $35 US, right? So the other currencies would be pegged against the USD. So why did people do that? That's because now if they allow the currencies to be pegged against the USD, that means when other countries need to grow their money supply, they can do that by holding not just the gold, but they can also hold the USD, right? So when they buy USD and they hold them as a reserve, it allows them to grow their money supply as well. And that sort of fixed the problem with the classical gold standard. So the common feature for these systems was that the currency value in these systems are basically fixed in the sense that it's either fixed against the gold or it's either fixed against the dollar, right? And what is the problem with that? So anytime when you fix a currency, right? So you can fix the nominal value of a currency, but you cannot fix its real value, right? So when we talk about a real currency value, it's the value that the market participants perceive about the currency, okay? So this is the supply and demand determined value. So as long as your nominal value or your fixed value is the same as the real value, then there's no problem at all. But when your real value starts to deviate from the fixed value, that is when something bad is going to happen, right? And that was the problem with the agency, what did I say, agency? That was the problem with the Asian currency crisis in 1997. So the problem started with the Asian currencies being fixed against the USD. And when the economic crisis hit these Asian countries, the real value of these currencies started to deviate a lot from the fixed value, right? And as investors realize that these currencies are not worth as much as they think they are, they started to dump the Asian assets, right? And that was when the crisis happened, okay? So realizing that fixing a currency is not as easy as they think, people started to flow their currency instead, right? So when they flow their currency, that means they allow the market demand and supply to determine the value of the currency. Okay. So in Australia, for example, we have a floating exchange rate regime. So the dollar, the Australian dollar, would fluctuate with supply and demand. Okay. We also talk about the European Union as an important establishment that gave birth to the euro currency. So since the establishment of the euro currency, it has become the second most important currency for international transactions. Right. Finally, we also talk about different currency crises. And what's important here is what they teach us about the limitations of each of the currency regimes, right? So for example, like we mentioned before with the Asian currency crisis, the problem was with the fixing of the currency, right? So this will be a very important issue for your homework assignment. If you look at the LMS side, you will see that I have uploaded 2 versions of the homework. And I think one of the questions in the homework relates to the currency crisis in Mexico, right? So you will need to understand how a certain feature of an exchange rate regime might cause a problem later on, right? So what are the limitations, in other words? So these are the main important issues for chapter 2. For today's tutorial, let's go through question 2 and 3 in class for chapter 2. I think with question 4, 8, and 9, they are quite self-explanatory. And the answers are quite straightforward, so I guess you guys can read at home. If there's any problem, you're welcome to ask me in consultation or something like that, right? But question 2 and 3 are quite tricky, so let's go through them in class. So with question 2, we are asked to explain the mechanism which restores the balance of payments equilibrium when it's disturbed under the gold standard, right? So can someone explain to me what is a classical gold standard in 1 or 2 sentences? In simple terms, what is a classical gold standard? You're welcome to unmute anytime if you want to talk.
Is it just when a country fixes?
Can you say it again, please? I can't hear you very well. Can you say that again?
Is it just when a country fixes their exchange rate against gold?
Yes, exactly right. So countries fixes their currencies against the gold. And then when you want to work out the exchange rate between countries, you just have to work out their relative gold content, right? So as an example, if I look at the US, for example, if for every ounce of gold in the US, it is traded at $30, and in the UK, for every ounce of gold, it is traded at £6, right? So that means $30, 30 US dollars would be equivalent to £6, yeah? So if that's the case, then if I want to work out the exchange rate between the pounds and the US, it will follow a 1:5 ratio, right? Which means that for every pound, it should be equivalent to 5 USD due to their relative gold content, right? So under the classical gold standard, any disequilibrium in the trade account in the balance of payment would be fixed through a price fixing flow mechanism. So this mechanism is a mechanism through which any imbalance in the trade account will be corrected by a counter flow of gold, right? What do we mean by that? Let's look at an illustration. So as an example, let's look at the case where the country has a trade deficit, right? So when we have a trade deficit, what does that mean? That means our trade account is negative, yeah? So our current account is negative. So when our trade account is negative, that means we are not selling as much as we are buying. Yeah. So we are buying more goods and services from overseas relative to we sell to overseas. Yeah. So in other words, we are the net consumer of the world. So we are the net buyer of goods and services. Yeah. So as we buy goods and services, there will be a net inflow of goods and services into our country. So we acquire goods and services from overseas. And because we are buying, we need to be paying to our trade partners, right? So we are the person that need to pay to our trade partner. So when we pay for the goods and services using gold, there will be an outflow of gold, right? So if we give them the gold to pay for our goods and services, there will be less gold in our system, yeah? So the amount of gold that we have would therefore reduce. So it's very important here under the classical gold standard that we understand that our money supply is fixed against the gold supply, right? So that whenever there is a decrease in gold, there will also be a decrease in the money supply in our system as well, okay? So because we fix our currency against the gold, whenever we have less gold, we also have less money in our economy, okay? So from economics U1, we know that whenever there is a decrease in the money supply, the prices in the country should be lower as well, right? And why is that the case? When we have less money to spend, we don't want to spend, right? So if I lose my job tomorrow, I'm not going to be spending on makeup and anything like that anymore. I'm just going to be spending money on food, right? So when we have less money supply in the system, we don't want to spend too much anymore. And if we don't consume, the price level would go down because now people have to reduce their price, right? The suppliers have to reduce their price to encourage consumers to buy, okay? So as we have less money, we have less demand for our goods and services, and therefore the prices of goods and services in our economy would go down as well, okay? Any questions about this? So as the price level in our economy goes down, it actually makes our goods and services more competitive in the international environment now, right? So when our goods and services are cheaper, foreign consumers would demand our goods and services more. And as they demand more, it actually helps us with the exports, yeah? So when they demand our goods and services more, the amount of exports that we can sell to them would be a bit higher, okay? So when exports increase, it actually helps us to reduce the trade deficit that we experience at the start. So when you have a higher level of export, the trade deficit would reduce and eventually it will disappear, right? It will go to zero, to equilibrium, yeah? So as you can see through this chart, whenever you have a trade imbalance, it will be corrected through the change in your money supply, and eventually it will go back to equilibrium, yeah? So similarly for a trade surplus, so when we have a trade surplus, this is the case when we have more exports than imports. So we are selling goods and services overseas more than we buy from overseas, yeah? So as a net producer, we have a net outflow of goods and services outside of our country. So we give them the goods and services. And in exchange, our trade partners, our foreign trade partners would have to pay for their goods and services, right? So when they pay, there is an inflow of gold into our system, yeah? So when we have a trade surplus, this is when our current account is positive. So in this case, because foreigners pay us, there will be an increase in gold circulating in our system, right? And once again, because we peg our currency against the gold, when we have more gold, we would also have more money supply in the system, right? So as we have more money supply in the system, our citizens will start to spend more, and as they spend more on goods and services, as they demand more goods and services, the prices of goods and services in our domestic economy also increase. Okay, so if I get a promotion tomorrow, I have more money, I will be spending more as well, right? So as I spend more, as the economy spend more, the demand for goods and services will increase, and therefore prices will increase as well. Okay. So following an increase in money supply, we should see an increase in prices as well. So now, if my goods and services becomes more expensive now, the foreign consumers would demand our goods and services less, right? Because it's too expensive for them now. So if that's the case, if foreign demand for our goods and services decreases, that means our exports would also go down, right? And our import would increase in a similar fashion. So as exports decrease, that means our trade surplus will also decrease, and eventually it should go back to equilibrium, which is 0. So if trade surplus decrease, eventually it should get to 0, which is the equilibrium, right? So once again, we can see that through this mechanism, anytime when you have a trade surplus, it actually gets corrected through a change in your money supply. So through the change in your gold supply and eventually your money supply. So this is the mechanism through which the trade imbalance is corrected automatically under a gold standard, right? Now, as you can see, for a country, say, if I really want to be selling more, right? If I really want to work hard and sell a lot of goods and services overseas, if I want to have a trade surplus for a long time, it's very hard for me to do, because under this system, every time when I have a trade surplus, it will be corrected eventually, right? So it will hit my exports eventually. So this mechanism makes the regime very stable, but at the same time, it's very limiting for countries to grow, right? So when I want to grow more, when I want to export more, eventually I will be punished because of the inflow of gold. Okay. So this was exactly the reason why the classical gold standard collapsed when the war happened. So during the war, during the World War I, people were not too concerned about how much their currencies are worth, but they were more concerned about how to finance the war, right? So as a result, people started to devalue their currency against the war. So as you devalue your currency against the war, against the gold, it actually makes the system unstable, right? So if every country started to disrespect the original arrangement, everyone devalue their currencies, the gold standard would collapse, right? So because of this reason, therefore, the classical gold standard didn't work anymore after the war broke out, and people introduced a new system called the gold exchange standard, right? Where people use not only just the gold, but also the dollar as an additional money supply. Okay, can we move on to question 3? So with question 3, we are dealing with the gold standard as well. In this case, we have a numerical example, right? So we have 2 countries here. We have the UK and we have France. So in the UK, if you want to exchange an ounce of gold, you can exchange it at £6. So every ounce of gold is worth £6 in the UK. In France, if you want to exchange an ounce of gold for francs, then you would exchange it at, for 12 francs, right? So this was before the euro. So in France, people still use the francs. So given the relative gold content of the two currencies, can we work out the implied exchange rate between the pound and the franc? So under the current equilibrium, how much is the pound worth in terms of the francs? So if 6 pounds are equivalent to 12 francs, that means each pound is equivalent to 2 francs, right? So the current exchange rate, the implied exchange rate should be 1 pound, 1 pound equals to 2 francs. Okay. Now, actually, when you observe the exchange rate market, when you observe the foreign exchange market, you see that the market is currently trading the pound at 2.2 francs instead. So in the market, the actual traded price for the pounds is, for every pound, it is traded at 2.2 francs. Okay. So what do we say about this situation? Are we thinking that the franc is, are we thinking that the pound is undervalued, or are we thinking that the pound is overvalued? Someone say something in the chat session. Overvalue, yes, Uni, thank you so much. So yes, if I look at these rates here, I think that a pound is only worth 2 francs, but the market is actually trading it at 2.2, right? So the market looks like it's overpriced in the pound. So question 1, how will you take advantage of this situation, right? So when there is a mispricing, when the market value is different from the fair value of an asset, this is when we call there is a mispricing, right? So when there is a mispricing, there's a potential for arbitrage profits. And by arbitrage, we mean that we want to sell at the overpriced market, and we want to buy at the underpriced market, right? So we see that later on in the calculation. So given that in this question, the pound is overpriced, overvalued, so if I want to arbitrage, I would be thinking about selling the pounds, right? So if something is overvalued, that means it's priced too high. So if I can sell at that high price, I would be better off relative to other people. Right? So starting point, I would therefore want to sell the pounds. So suppose that I have 6 pounds to trade for this strategy. If I want to sell the pounds in the exchange rate market, how much can I get? How much can I exchange the pound for? If I sell the pounds for the francs, hang on 1 second, I'm just checking the chat. 7.2, no, it doesn't look right. So 7.2 is not the answer. Some other answers? Hang on. 13.2, yes, exactly. 13.2, right, spot on. Well done, guys. So if 1 pound is worth 2.2, that means for 6 pounds, if I want to find out the equivalent franc amount, then I'll take 6, I'll times it by 2.2, and that will give me the amount of francs, right? So in this case, it is 13.2. So once I sell the pounds to get the francs, what do I do next, guys? So step one, correct. We want to sell the pounds where it is overpriced. Step two, we want to buy back the pounds. And somehow we need to involve this second exchange rate over here. Right. So to explain the next few steps, so what I'm going to do next is I'm going to be exchanging the pounds. I'm going to exchange the francs back into the pounds indirectly through the gold exchange, right? So I'm going to exchange the francs into gold first, and then I'm going to exchange the gold into pounds again. So let's see how we can do that. So once I get the francs from the exchange rate market in step one, I will then go to France. I will exchange 13.2 francs that I got from step one into gold. So if we recall from the question, in France, for every ounce of gold, it is equivalent to 12 francs, right? So we can exchange 12 francs for 1 ounce of gold. So if we can exchange 1 ounce of gold for 12 francs, if we have 13.2 francs, how much gold can we get? $13.2 francs. So I have 13.2 francs. And I know that the price of gold is 12 francs per ounce. So if I want to buy gold now, how much gold can I get with 13.2 francs? Someone has the answer? Yes. Hang on 1 second. Let me just pull it up. 1.2 ounces. Very close, but not correct. Yes, Isabel. So 1.1. Trisenda, 1.1. Yes, correct. Spot on, guys. So it should be 1.1, right? So if I take 13.2, I divide it by 12. That will give me the amount of gold I get, right? So 13.2 divided by 12 is 1.1. Okay, so once I get the gold in France, I will then go to England and exchange the gold back into the pounds, right? So let's recall from the previous slide. So for 1 ounce of gold in England, you can exchange it for 6 pounds, yeah? So if you have 1.1 ounce, how much pounds can you get? Okay. Yes, I've got an answer here. 6.6. Yes, Isabel, spot on. So 6.6. So if I take 1.1, which is the amount of gold I have, and I times it with the price of 1 ounce of gold, I will get 6.6. Yeah. So when I exchange 1.1 ounce of gold to pounds in England, I will get 6.6 pounds. Okay. Yes, someone asked something. 6.6. Yes. Exactly, right, spot on. So in this case, our profit is 0.6 pounds, okay? So we started with 6 pounds, we end with 6.6. That means our profit is 0.6, yeah? So if I calculate the rate of return for this strategy, what is the rate of return? So the rate of return here is, I take the profits, which is the capital gain, I divide it by the initial investment, which is 6 pounds, and that will give us 10%, all right? Okay. So, yes, someone say something. 10%, yes, spot on. Yep. Okay. I'm gonna check the chat screen again. That's all right. I see it now. Thank you, Isabel. So in the second part of the question, we got asked what is the effect of shipping costs on the strategy, right? So the exercise that we have done so far shows us the profit, a theoretical profit of this strategy, right? This means this is a profit without taking into account any transaction costs or shipping costs, yeah? So in this case, we have to ship the gold from France to England, yeah, which is a lot of work to do. So suppose that the cost of shipping the gold from France to England is £2. In this case, do we still want to carry out this strategy? If the costs are £2 to get the gold from France to England, do we want to do anything with it? No, right, spot on. We don't want to do anything because the net profit will be negative, okay? So the effect of shipping costs here is that it will erode the profit that we get, and the more shipping costs we have to incur, the lower, the less attractive this arbitrage opportunity is, right? So that is it for question 3. Now, given the time that we have, I would suggest us go to chapter 3. And if we have time, we can go back to these questions, yeah? So the rest of these questions are quite straightforward. I guess you can read at home. So with chapter 3, we talk about the balance of payments. So in a nutshell, the balance of payment is a way that countries record their transactions going in and out of the country, right? So this is a double entry bookkeeping. That means every time when you record a transaction, it will be recorded into 2 different entries, one for credit and one for debit, yeah? So the general rule is that anytime when you have a receipt from foreigners, so whenever they pay us, whenever they give us money, it will be recorded as a credit. So cash inflow is a credit. In contrast, whenever we pay to foreigners, whenever we have a cash outflow, it's recorded as a debit, right? So there's nothing much about it. The important point here is that the balance of payment is important for us to understand the value of the currency, right? Why is that the case? It's because the transactions under the balance of payments tell us about the demand and supply of the currency, okay? So for example, if we think about the demand, say for the AUD, whenever a foreigner demands goods and services from Australia, then they create a demand for the AUD as well, right? So when they buy goods and services from Australia, they need to pay to Australian producers, and as they pay, they create a demand for the AUD, right? So they need to exchange their currency to the AUD, creating a demand for the AUD, okay? Similarly, for financial investments, so if an overseas investor wants to invest in Australian stock markets, they will create a demand for the Australian dollars as well, right? Because they have to pay for their transaction, okay? In terms of supply, so what are the factors that influence the supply of Australian dollars? So for example, if Australian citizens, if we go out to buy goods and services overseas, so whenever we acquire goods and services from overseas, we need to pay them. And as we pay to them, we supply the Australian dollars into the international market, right? So there's an outflow of Australian dollars from Australia to the rest of the world, right? So that increases the demand for the supply for Australian dollars in the international market, okay? Similarly for foreign investments, so when Australian citizens invest overseas in in financial assets, they increase the supply of the Australian dollars as well. Okay. Now, question. So, if I am the Central Bank of Australia, if I'm the Reserve Bank of Australia, and if I buy foreign reserves, say if I buy looks like it's back. Can you guys see me now? I can see you guys now, so I guess this should be okay. Thank you guys. It just shut down on me for some reason. Okay, so where were we? So we were talking a central bank, the Australian Central Bank, and if they want to buy the USD to hold as the reserve, what do we think will happen to the supply and demand of the Australian dollars? So when the RBA goes out to buy USD to hold as the reserve, what would happen to the demand or supply of the Australian dollars? Did someone say something? Did someone want to say something? In the chat screen. Demand will go up. Any other idea? So no, the answer is not demand. So the answer should be the supply. So when we buy something, we increase the demand of that thing, right? So in this case, when we buy the USD, we are increasing the demand for the USD, not the Australian dollars. Okay. Some other idea? What do we think will happen to the Australian dollars? Okay, one more person. Oopsie. What did I just press? Going down, demand goes down. So I guess, so in this case, when we buy the USD, right, there will be an inflow of USD into Australia. So there will be an inflow of USD in the Australian economy. But in exchange, when we buy the USD, we have to pay them, right? So we have to exchange it for the Australian dollars. So when we exchange the Australian dollars for the USD, we create an outflow of Australian dollars outside of Australia, right? So when that happens, effectively, we are increasing the supply of the Australian dollars for foreign investors, yeah? So in this case, we increase the supply of the dollars for foreign investors. Okay. Does that make sense to everyone? So there is an outflow of Australian dollars from Australia to the rest of the world, and therefore the supply of Australian dollars for the rest of the world would increase as well, right? So the amount of Australian dollars for the rest of the world increases through this action, yeah? Okay. So also in the lecture, we talk about the persistence of the balance of payments for a few countries. And in this tutorial, we are going through 2 countries, yeah? So we're talking about the US and Japan in question 3 and 4. So question 1, define the balance of payments. This is what we talk about at the start. So it's just a way that countries record their transactions in and out of the country. And this is the double entry bookkeeping. So you have 2 transactions. You have 2 entries for each transaction, right? Let's look at question 3. So in this question, we are looking at the US trade balance over the last few decades from the 1980s. So if we look at the slide over here, in the US, from the 1980s, they have been experiencing a positive capital account for a long time. In contrast, their current account has been negative, right? Which means that with the capital account, when you have a positive capital account, that means foreign investors invest more in your country relative to you going out and invest overseas, right? So there is an inflow of capital into the US over time. In contrast with the current account, they have experienced a persistent deficit over time, which means that they have been importing more goods and services relative to their export, yeah? So in the US, they have been exporting a little bit less relative to how much they import, right? So why is that the case? So there have been a few factors that contribute to the persistent trade deficit in the US. So the first main reason is there has been a strong demand for USD over time, right? So why is that the case? If we recall from the dollar-based gold exchange regime, so under this regime, other countries peg their currencies against the US and they hold the USD as a foreign reserve, right? So as they demand the USD to hold as a foreign reserve, they create a demand for the USD, right? So when they hold the USD for foreign reserve, they are buying the USD, so they are creating a demand for USD. Okay. The second factor has something to do with investor confidence in the US economy. So after the war, after World War I and World War II, the US has emerged as the largest economy in the world, right? And over time, they have maintained that position for a long time, okay? So because of their position in the world economy, investors have been very confident in their economy, right? The second factor is that their financial markets are quite free. So it's quite internationalized in the sense that everyone can invest in US financial markets, right? If you want to invest now in US stocks, you can go to ComSec and create an international trade account, right? So because of this confidence, investors invest a lot in US financial markets. And as they invest in financial markets in the US, they create a demand for the USD as well, right? When you have a strong demand for a currency, what happens is that the value of that currency would also be quite high, yeah? So when you have a strong demand, your currency would also be quite expensive. And as a result, it makes goods and services produced in the US less competitive relative to other countries, right? And that explains why they have a low level of exports. The second reason is that they have, with their trade partners, their main trade partners like China or Japan, they have undervalued their currencies. So they have kept their currency values quite low relative to the USD, right? So why is that the case? Why do we think countries want to keep their currency values low? One reason is that so China or Japan have been the net exporters of the world, right? So they have been the net producers of the world. So if they want to export more into other countries, then they have to make sure that their goods and services are competitive. So one way to do that is to make sure that your prices are low, right? So when you undervalue your currency, you're making your goods and services cheaper to make it more competitive to other goods and services. Yeah? So because of this reason, it explains why it's harder for US companies to export to these countries, to their trade partners, relative to these countries exporting to the US. Right. Also, in the past, there has been a high level of consumption and a low level of savings in the US, partly because, especially after the dot-com bubble, 2001, the US central bank has kept the interest rates very low, right? So when you have a low level of interest rates, it discourages people from saving, and therefore they will spend more, okay? So as they spend more, they demand more goods and services, making it easier for other countries to sell goods and services into the US. Okay. Finally, over the past few years, US industries have also seen a higher level of concentration, meaning that it's very common now for an industry to have one or two big players, and the other players are much less powerful, right? So as a result, US industries becomes more monopolistic over time. And as you have a monopoly in place, the prices of goods and services will also be higher, right? So when you have a very strong player in the market, they don't have to cut their prices to be competitive at all, right? So as a result, the goods and services produced in the US becomes less attractive relative to other goods and services, right? So all of these factors explains why exports have been low and imports have been high in the US, okay? And the main factor that makes this trend very persistent is the confidence of investor in the US economy, okay? So because foreign investors are willing to hold US financial assets, it makes it, it helps to finance the trade deficits in the US, right? I think we have time for one or two more questions. So let's go through question 4. So in question 4, we are talking about an opposite case. So we're talking about Japan, where their trade balance is exactly the opposite to the US. So with Japan, over the past few decades, they have had a positive current account, meaning that they have run trade surpluses for a long time. So they have been producing more than they are consuming. In contrast, their capital account has been negative, meaning that they have been investing overseas a bit more than than foreign investors investing in Japan, right? So why is that the case? So number one, as we mentioned before, the trade partners for the US have kept their currency's value quite low. So Japan is one of the example. They have kept their yen relatively weak relative to the USD, and the main purpose is to make their goods and services more competitive, right, relative to US industries. So one way that they can support a low level of their currency value is through massive capital exports to other countries, right? So what does that mean? That means Japanese investors have been investing a lot overseas. So if you think about Southeastern Asian countries, for example, Japan has been a big investor in these countries, right? So for example, in Vietnam, Japan, I think is, at one time they was the largest foreign investors in Vietnam. And I think they are still in the top 3 or something at the moment. So foreign direct investments from Japan to other countries, especially developing countries, have been quite high. So as they invest in foreign assets overseas, when they acquire foreign assets overseas, they need to supply the Japanese yen into other countries, right? So as they supply the Japanese yen into the rest of the world, the value of the yen becomes lower, right? So when you have a higher supply, the price of the yen will also go down. And that helps with their export as well. In the last reason is because of the consumption behavior of Japanese. So in Japan, the markets are quite close in the sense that, sorry, this is a typo, should be fine. Okay. So the markets in Japan are quite close up in the sense that Japanese people prefer to consume domestic goods and services. So, for example, let's take the car industry as an example. If we go to a car park in Australia, we'll see that we can see a lot of cars, right? We can see Japanese cars, we can see Korean cars, we can see American cars, we can see European cars, so on and so forth. So our car industry here is very internationalized. Whereas in Japan, if you walk down the street in Japan, you will see that most of the time you'll be looking at Japanese cars. You'll be looking at Toyota, for example. So the behavior of the consumers in Japan is quite different in the sense that they prefer domestic goods, right? As a result, they don't need to import a lot of goods and services from overseas, and that explains the low level of imports. Okay. So I think we have enough time for one more question. Let's go to question, I guess let's go to question 10, problem 10 at the end. So I think this question is important because it will help us understand what goes into the balance of payments and how to read the balance of payments, right? So the balance of payments is very similar to a statement of cash flows. This is a statement of flows, right? So anytime when you see a positive number, that means it's a cash inflow into the country. Every time you see a negative number, that means it's a cash outflow, yeah? So outside of the country. So in problem 1, if you have the question with you, it basically asks us to calculate the missing information on this balance of payments. So on the slide, I've got 4 different missing figures. The first one is for section 2.2, which is imported merchandise. The second one is the balance on current account. The third one is the balance on the capital account. And finally, the statistical discrepancy, right? So let's go through it one by one. So how do we read information from a balance of payments, yeah? So let's take section 2, for example. So the number here in section 2 is the cumulative sum of all the subcategories under section 2, right? So this figure minus 1,800 something is the sum of the 3 figures here that we see. So if we want to work out the value of merchandise, therefore, it's simply just the difference between the sum, the whole sum, negative 1,800, and the 2 small subcategories under section 2, right? So therefore, if I want to work out the value of merchandises, imported merchandise for the US in 2000, then I will take the total sum, which is 1,800 minus 1,800. I minus the 2 other categories. So because I'm minusing a negative number, it becomes a positive, right? So this exercise gives me a number of minus 1,200 something, yeah, for imported merchandise in 2000. The second calculation relates to the balance on current account. So the balance on current account is simply just the sum of the three sections under the current account, which is section 1 for exports, section 2 for import, and section 3 for unilateral transfers, right? So for exports, in 2000, the amount of export was around 1,400. The amount of import is negative 1,800. With unilateral transfers, it will be the sum of these two numbers here. So if we sum all these numbers up, we'll find that the current account for the US in 2000 was a negative 444 something, right, billion. So in this case, the US has a trade deficit in 2000 by about $444 billion, okay? So in terms of the next calculation, we're calculating the balance on capital account. So this is for financial transactions in and out of the US, yeah? So when you have a positive number here, that means it's a cash inflow into the US. So foreign investors are investing in the US by this much. And when you have a negative number, that means US investors are investing outside of the US, yeah? So it's similar to before. What I'm doing here is I'm just adding up the balance of the three sections under the capital account. So for direct investment, I would add up these two numbers. It will go here. For section 5, sorry, which is the portfolio investment, it will be the sum of these two numbers. And finally, for other investments, I would take the sum of these two numbers. Yeah. So by this calculation, my capital account is around 400 and something as well. So I have a positive cash flow going into the US, which means that foreign investors invest more in the US relative to US investors investing outside. Right. For the statistical discrepancies, I'm going to use the balance of payments identity equation, which is this equation over here, to find out the statistical discrepancies, right? So we start with this equation, which means that all of the accounts under the balance of payments should add up to 0. What we want to find is we want to find the statistical discrepancies. So what we want to do is we want to rearrange the equation, bring everything else to the right, and leave the statistical discrepancy to the left, right? So in this case, if I do so, and because I have all the other information already, if I do so, I will find that the statistical discrepancy is about $0.73 billion, okay? So this exercise hopefully will help you to understand how the balance of payments is constructed and what the numbers mean, right? So the important point is what the flows mean. So when you have a positive number, that is a positive cash flow going in. And when you have a negative number, that's a cash flow outside, okay? So it's a cash outflow. All right, so I think we run out of time. We are 1 minute past. So I'm gonna conclude the tutorial for now. Is there any more questions before we conclude? If there is no more questions for today's tutorial, I'm just going to conclude now. Thank you guys. Thank you so much for zooming in. As we mentioned before, this will be recorded because someone told me that the echo recording didn't work. So as a backup, I think I'm going to upload this on the LMS as well if people cannot access the echo. So if there's no more questions, then I'll conclude for now. I'll see you guys back for the lecture at 4 p.m. Or the tutorial next week. Yeah. Thank you so much, guys, and I'll see you next time.